Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
Yes, many workplaces, the general myth is outdoor workers are more exposed. What we have found is many of the indoor places, if they don't have proper ventilation, their temperatures are much, much higher than what it's outside.
चीज सोच लो, हमें एक दिन जाता तो 2 दिन हमें छुट्टी करना पड़ता है, तो हमारी तबीयत भी खराब हो जाती है गर्मी के चक्कर में। तो हम 12-12 घंटे काम करते हैं।
Where can you go and find a toilet near a salt pan? It's open sea. So we see those kind of factors exacerbate their issues. So there are differences because of the core risk factors, not because of the heat. Heat affects people exactly the same.
ये था गर्मी का चक्कर में नाइट में चले जाते हैं।
नाइट में कितने बजे?
5 बजे 6 बजे जाते हैं, आते 2 बजे।
2 बजे। तो आप लोग के लिए सेफ रहता है? औरतों के लिए
सेफ तो नहीं रहता, क्या करूँ, लेकिन मजबूरी में जाना पड़ता है हम लोग।
गर्मी में तो कह रहे हैं कि बहुत दिक्कत है, तो दाने वाने हो गए बहुत। अभी मैं 1.5-2 महीने से काम नहीं कर रहा है, 1-2 घंटे काम करता हूँ, मैं घर चला जाता हूँ क्योंकि मेरे इधर जलन मचने लगती है, पसीना आता है ना यहाँ पे, तो ऐसे जलन मचने लगती है, तो घर चला जाता हूँ।
Welcome to The Heat Shift, a 6-part investigative series produced by The Migration Story. And I'm your host, Bhoomika Choudhury, a human rights lawyer and corporate accountability researcher. Across the series, we trace extreme heat from the human body to corporate supply chains, courtrooms, and parliamentary chambers. We begin today in episode 1 with the most basic question, the one our economic systems consistently refuse to answer, and which is, what does heat actually do to a worker's day? What does it do to a worker's body and their livelihood? Here's how this episode works. We first go into the field and cover 2 industries, 2 very different kinds of heat exposure. We start with waste picking workers on a landfill where toxic fumes become more dangerous as the heat rises through the day, and underground temperatures run hotter than the surface during summers, hot enough to burn a worker's hands. Then we move to delivery workers. For them, any stoppage can mean a wage penalty. Even when temperatures are at their peak, some are required to keep working through a mandated 3.5-hour window between noon and 4 p.m. And running through both of these, and not saved for the end, but woven in as we go, is the science behind all of it. We have Dr. Vidya Venugopal, who has spent over a decade measuring heat at workplaces across the country, real readings taken on site. As each worker describes what heat does to them, we'll bring in her research to explain why, what's actually happening physiologically, how it differs for men and women, and what does the body level data tells us that a testimony alone can't. Once we have heard from both the industries, we'll sit with her directly for a final few questions that pull it all together. We start where the evidence is hardest to look away from, not a factory floor, but a landfill on the edge of Delhi, where the ground itself has become a heat source.
आप वो दूसरे लैंडफिल की बात कर रहे थे?
गलत
जी।
लोग जहाँ रहते हैं 500 मीटर तक जो पानी है पीने का और ग्राउंड वाटर जो है वो बिल्कुल खराब हो गया है, क्योंकि वो जो लैंडफिल का इतना मीथेन और कूड़े से जो निकलने वाली जो गंध है वो पूरे इलाके में।
Gazipur has been taken the city's waste since 1984. It's grown into a mound roughly 65 to 70 meters high. Imagine something as tall as the Qutub Minar. And it keeps rising by close to 10 meters a year. Fires have broken out, often in the last few years, fed by trapped methane, and these burn for days, which send black smoke over the neighborhoods which dwell around it. I am standing at the base of the mountain where there's a slum, and there are homes built out of tin sheets and tarpaulin right up against the dump. The people who live here are mostly waste pickers themselves, earning somewhere around 250 to 300 rupees a day, sorting through what the rest of the city throws away. And this is where our first worker testimonies come from. For the thousands of informal waste pickers who climb this site daily, thermal exposure is compounded by hazardous labor. There are no shaded rest stops, no drinking water stations, and no recognized employer to provide basic protective care. Akbar Ali works with the Basti Suraksha Sangh, a collective organizing on behalf of waste pickers and sanitation workers. We asked him a simple question: how has heat changed things for the waste picking community?
हमने देखा है कि दिल्ली के अंदर बहुत तेजी से ब्यूटिफिकेशन के नाम पे जिस तरीके से ढलाव को हटा दिया गया, ढलाव मतलब जहां लोग अपने घरों के कूड़े डालते थे जो कि सोसाइटियों में आरडब्ल्यू के बाहर होता था, आज दिल्ली के अंदर नाम मात्र ही बचे हैं, ज़्यादातर को हटा दिया गया है और उनके जगह पे उन जो ढलाव थे वहाँ पे अमूल, मदर डेयरी, अलग अलग तरीके से चीज़ों को डेवलप किया गया है। लेकिन जो ढलाव ख़त्म होने के वजह से जो कूड़ा में काम करने वाले जो बहनें हैं और जो पुरुष है जो कि कूड़ा सेग्रीगेशन करते थे और ढलाव एक जगह होता था जहाँ पे लोग बैठ के आराम से काम करते थे, तो वो ख़त्म होने की वजह से लोगों की परेशानी जो है वो बढ़ी है।
When segregation centers shut down, sorting moved into the open with no shade, no shelter, nothing built around the fact that this work would now happen under the sun. So for the thousands of workers who climb these sites daily, the heat isn't the only problem. It's how little government planning has accounted for it. There are no shaded rest stops, no drinking water stations, no recognized employer. And so it's not always a policy written that fails workers. It's also just a policy that never thought about them at all.
देखिए, हीट वाला जो मुद्दा है वो वेस्ट पिकरों को सबसे ज़्यादा परेशान में डाल दिया है। वो इसलिए क्योंकि 2020 के बाद जब से कोविड आया था, कोविड के बाद से लोगों का जो नज़रिया है खासकर कूड़े को लेके वो बिल्कुल बदल गया है। अब लोग ना अपने सोसाइटी में वेस्ट सेग्रीगेशन करने देते हैं, ना कहीं पब्लिक प्लेस में लोग अपना वेस्ट सेग्रीगेशन कर पाते हैं और जो रिजर्व जगह था जहाँ पे वेस्ट सेग्रीगेशन होता था, जो ढलाव है वो बंद हो चुके हैं। तो इसलिए वेस्ट पिकर लोग हमेशा ओपन स्पेस कहीं पे भी जहाँ पे लोग आते जाते नहीं, वो नाले के किनारे हो सकते हैं, पार्क के साइड में कहीं पे भी, या तो कहीं ओपन जगह जहाँ पे लोग आते जाते नहीं है, ओपन स्पेस होता है जो कि पूरे खुला आसमान के नीचे इतनी तपती धूप में वो काम करने के लिए मजबूर होते हैं। तो गर्मी का प्रभाव आज के टाइम पे वेस्ट पिकर कम्युनिटी पे बड़ा है और साथ ही साथ हम देखते हैं कि इसके साथ साथ लोगों का जो दिनचर्या है काम करने का वो बहुत बढ़ गया है, क्योंकि लोग एकदम से 1 घंटा काम नहीं कर पाते हैं। वो कहते हैं कि ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा हम 20-25 मिनट काम करते हैं, उससे हमें इतनी दिक्कत होती है कि हम बार बार कहीं ना कहीं छाँव में जाके बैठ जाते हैं। और जब बात करते हैं कि छाँव करने की, तो प्रशासन जो है वो ओपन जगहों में भी छाँव करने के लिए नहीं देती है। तो हीट का एक इस तरीके से जो इफेक्ट है वो लोगों पे पड़ा है। इसका मेन जो हीट को लेके हम बात करते हैं कि जो लोगों का जो कनेक्टिविटी है घरों से है, एक बिल्डिंग हम देखते हैं कि 10 माले का भी है, 5 माले का भी है, 6 माले का है, और वेस्ट पिकर लोग हमेशा बिल्डिंगों में चढ़ते हैं उतरते हैं। एक उनका बॉडी इतना हीट रहता है इन बिल्डिंगों में चढ़ने उतरने को लेके, फिर ओपन साइट में आके जो कूड़ा सेग्रीगेशन करते हैं, फिर उनका जो पूरा कनेक्टिविटी है वो कूड़े से है और कूड़ा गर्मी में बहुत ज्यादा गर्मी पैदा करता है। जब भी वेस्ट पिकर कूड़ा छाटता है तो उससे बहुत तेजी से स्मेल आता है और बहुत गर्मी उससे निकलती है, जिससे उनको बहुत ज्यादा परेशानी होती है। खासकर जो औरतें हैं जो वो काम करती हैं वो ये कहते हैं कि एक बार मन करता है कि हम काम ही करना बंद कर दें, क्योंकि बर्दाश्त नहीं होता है। और खासकर जो महिला साथी है उनको दिक्कत ये है कि वो ज्यादा देर खड़े होकर काम भी नहीं कर पाती हैं। एक तो गर्मी है, फिर क्या है कि वो एक किसी भी कार्ड के ऊपर जो रिक्शा होता है उसके ऊपर बैठ के वो सेग्रीगेशन करते हैं।
That's a distinction we hear now from Dr. Vidya Venugopal. That heat harm isn't just about the temperature in the air. It's also about what the body is doing while it's in that heat and whose body it is. For example, climbing a mountain of waste repeatedly in the sun, like Mr. Sheikh Alam mentioned, is a different physiological load than standing still in the same heat. Dr. Vidya has spent over a decade measuring exactly that. So we asked her, what does sustained heat actually do to a worker's body? Depending on whose body it is.
Let me give you a very, very simple example. It is like compared to walking, compared to the difference between walking, jogging and running, right? let us say, and then for the same person, same environment, same heat exposure, there are 3 different types of responses and reactions that you will get from this kind of activity. So that is what a laborer we are looking at. That is called the workload. When you're walking, when you're slow walking, your workload is probably, let us say, 170 kilowatts. But when you're jogging, it's about 240. When you're running, it's about 380 or something like that. So depending on how much exertion you're doing, you're going to be getting your responses. So your core body temperature starts to slowly rise. And then when your core body temperature starts to rise, the natural defense mechanism of the body is to start to sweat. There is a vasodilation that happens. Vasodilation means your arteries start to get a little bit dilated. So all the blood goes to the extremities, and there is a temperature differential that happens between your skin and your external environment. It's more like, taking the water from fridge and keeping a refrigerator and keeping outside. Then you start. That is exactly the mechanism that happens. And that thermoregulatory mechanism will cool your body, especially when there is wind. If you don't have wind, then it is a different story. Or if the air is saturated with water, when you have high humidity, then what evaporative cooling also is reduced. See, one of the things that apart from this core body temperature rise, you will have an increase in heart rate. This you all might have noticed. Whenever we are working in heat, you will start to breathe faster, and then your stroke volume also increases and your heart rate starts to go. These are the things that we actually measure in response to heat stress. These are called heat strain parameters. See, one of the things that we do is most of the times, like I said, bread and butter is working in 40 pluses. More than anybody else, my research team is the one who is exposed first, and it's not easy.
कि वेस्ट पिकरों को कोई सुविधा सरकार की तरफ से नहीं मिलता है। यहाँ तक कि सरकार मानती भी नहीं है कि कोई वेस्ट पिकर है जो कि कूड़े को लेके काम करते हैं। और हम जब वेस्ट वर्करों से बात करते हैं काम के लिए, तो उनका सबसे बड़ा जो रीजन है काम नहीं करने का गर्मी में, वो ये है कि सैड उनके लिए कहीं पे भी नहीं है।
तो अकबर अली जी, क्या ये इनफॉर्मल वर्कर्स हैं, गवर्नमेंट हायर नहीं करती है?
ये सब इनफॉर्मल वर्कर है, इसमें गवर्नमेंट का कोई रोल नहीं है। और जो ढलाव में काम करने वाले वेस्ट पिकर हैं, उनको भी ढलाव में इसलिए काम करने दिया जाता है ताकि वो ढलाव को साफ सुथरा रख सके। उनको कोई सैलरी नहीं मिलता, कुछ भी नहीं मिलता। तो इस तरीके से लोग अपने काम को बचाने के लिए ये सारे काम करते हैं।
No recognition as a worker means no legal entitlement to protective equipment and no employer liability if he's harmed. And as we'll hear later in the episode, no formal channel to even report a heat-related injury if one happens. That absence of recognition is not a side detail. It's the structural reason why heat harm in this sector and in any sector goes undocumented and unaddressed.
मेरा नाम अशरफ अली है।
गर्मी में आप लोगों को किस तरह की दिक्कत हुई है?
हमारे ऐसे हाथ बिल्कुल ही ऐसे हो जा रहे हैं ये गर्मी के चक्कर में। ये कभी नहीं होता था हमारे, ये इसी साल इतने गर्मी के चक्कर में हमारा असर।
कितने घंटे काम करते हैं आप?
काम तो 12 घंटा करीब करते हैं।
क्या गवर्नमेंट आप लोगों को किसी तरह का ग्लव्स या कुछ देती है कि ताकि टेम्परेचर थोड़ा कम रहे, या कोई शेड जहाँ पर आप रेस्ट कर सकें?
हमें तो आज तक का कभी चीज़ मिला नहीं इधर। हमें क्या इधर किसी को भी बहुत ही कम जो भाई हमारे लेके आ जाते तो कभी हमें मिलता, नहीं तो ऐसे कोई भी हमें कोई नहीं देता। प्लीज सोच लो, हमें एक दिन जाता तो 2 दिन हमें छुट्टी करना पड़ता, तो हमारी तबीयत भी खराब हो जाती है गर्मी के चक्कर में। तो हम 12-12 घंटे काम करते हैं, हमारा कभी बीपी लो हो जाता है, कभी बुखार चढ़ जाता है हमें। हम एक दिन जाते हैं, कभी 2 दिन नहीं आते, कभी 2 दिन जाते हैं तो हम 3-4 दिन नहीं जा पाते।
और अगर आप एक दिन का काम छूटता है तो कितने पैसे आपके नुकसान होते हैं?
1200 रुपये 1300 रुपये नुकसान है
एक दिन के।
The vulnerability of waste picking community and sanitation workers is also deeply gendered. These female workers face systemic challenges that magnify heat stress, and we'll hear it from them about their experience.
दिक्कत तो बहुत होता है, तो कह रहा हूँ ना, काम नहीं करता।
जैसे सर चक्कर आता है आप लोगों को?
चक्कर आता है, कमजोरी होता है, सिर भी घूमता है, दर्द होता है।
और आप लोग टॉयलेट कहाँ जाते हैं?
टॉयलेट तो यहाँ पे तो है नहीं, अभी तो घर पे है।
घर जाते हैं?
पहले तो बहुत दूर दूर में जाते थे, ये तो हाल में तो टॉयलेट घर बना, बार बाहर जाता है, बार बहुत दूर दूर में जाता है।
The worker that we just spoke to described 2 risks colliding at once: heat and safety. And that collision isn't incidental. And that's why we went to Dr. Vidya and asked her the gendered impact of heat stress. And what does it mean for women?
Many of our women who are working in construction sector are being excluded. Preferential hiring is happening because women cannot accommodate, especially the lower class, cannot accommodate working in the nights because they have caregiving responsibilities, children's responsibilities, issues like that. The numbers, I think it's about the societal impact of this heat. So if you work in night, there is no heat. The temperature is only 22 point, means everybody is working safe. But is it the right kind of practice? Because I am advocating against it, or I am advocating in a manner because, you have done women empowerment. And now it's like being pushed back for another 3 decades because women are not able to manage the time. So many women try, and then at one point they had to let go of their jobs. So we are actually excluding women from workforce. So does heat directly affect women? Maybe not because they're sitting at home. But does heat affect women? Yes, because they're not even getting the jobs. Right? That is one thing.
If we see on the roads of Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Hyderabad, Bengaluru, a different kind of worker is facing the same heat with a different kind of pressure. And here we're talking about delivery workers. A delivery rider's obligation is just to the clock, one which is set by an algorithm that doesn't know, doesn't care what the temperature is outside. Mohammad Irfan writes for a food delivery platform. We asked him what a day looks like when the temperature climbs.
गर्मी से आप लोगों को क्या दिक्कत होती है? गर्मी के मौसम में किस तरह की आपको दिक्कत होती है, वो मैं जानना चाहती हूँ खासकर।
गर्मी में तो कह रहा है कि बहुत दिक्कत है, तो दाने वाने हो गए बहुत। अभी मैं 1.5-2 महीने से काम नहीं कर रहा है, 1-2 घंटे काम करता हूँ, मैं घर चला जाता हूँ क्योंकि मेरे इधर जलन मचने लगती है, पसीना आता है ना यहाँ पे, तो जलन मचने लगती है, तो घर चला जाता हूँ। और अभी पिछले हफ्ते थोड़ा बारिश हुआ था, मौसम सही हुआ था, यानी सही काम हुआ था पिछले हफ्ते, तो अभी बहुत दिक्कत बारिश में।
तो बहुत गर्मी होती है तो कंपनी आप लोगों का ध्यान रखती है?
नहीं, कंपनी को ध्यान नहीं रखती है हमारा, हमें को भी अपना ध्यान रखना पड़ता है, 2 बोतल पानी ले जानी पड़ती है। और ये सरकार ने भी कही वो लगा रखा, कोल्ड स्टोर को भी हटा दिया है, यानी मेरे को लग रहा है खाली कोल्ड स्टोर लगाया था वीडियो बनाने के लिए, मेरे हिसाब से लग रहा है, क्योंकि 10-15 दिन तक तो वहाँ लगा था कोल्ड स्टोर, जो अब वो हट गया वहाँ से। ज़्यादा लग रहा है वीडियो बना के और हटा दिया लग रहा है मेरे ख्याल।
गर्मी के दिनों में कितने घंटे काम करते हैं आप?
कम से कम 14 घंटे काम करना पड़ता है, क्योंकि कंपनी का वो होता है रूल कि भाई 28 ऑर्डर मारोगे जब आपको इतने रुपये, क्या नाम है, आज 368 रुपये है इंसेंटिव, तो आदमी सोचता है कि चलो भाई थोड़ा सुबह जल्दी जाके रात भर देर तक कर लें, जब तक ऑर्डर पूरा नहीं होता आदमी करता ही रहता है, यानी सोच के यार थोड़ा ये ऑर्डर पूरा हो जाएगा तो 368 रुपये इंसेंटिव मिल जाएगा, इससे पेट्रोल का खर्चा निकल जाएगा, और जो दिन में खाया हुआ था खाना वाना उससे खर्चा निकल जाएगा। 700-800-900 रुपये काम होता है इसमें पूरे दिन में, यानी सुबह 9 से लेके रात के 11 बजे तक। कंपनी की पॉलिसी ये है कि लंच टाइम में क्या नाम है 3.25 घंटे रहना पड़ेगा लॉगिन, और डिनर टाइम में भी 3.5 घंटे रहना पड़ेगा लॉगिन, जब इंसेंटिव मिलेगा।
तो गर्मी में जैसे 12 से 4 के बीच में आपको कितने घंटे काम करना है?
3.5 घंटे लॉगिन रहना ही पड़ेगा, कमर्शियली है।
12 से 4 के बीच
में जब इंसेंटिव मिलेगा तो नहीं मिलेगा। अच्छा कोई ऑर्डर कैंसिल हो गया तो भी इंसेंटिव नहीं मिलेगा, और किसी कस्टमर ने अगर कंप्लेंट कर दिया, जैसे खाना वाना फैल वगैरह गया, यानी जो पैकिंग इशू थे, यानी कि गरम खाना पैक करेंगे तो भाप बन के लीक करेगा, जैसे कुकर में खाना बनाता है सीटी वजह से लीक नहीं होता है, आग बाद होता है, वो भी कस्टमर कंप्लेंट कर देता है, क्या बोलते हैं स्प्लिट ऑर्डर, तो उससे भी नहीं मिलता है, यानी कि इंसेंटिव। रेट कम हो गया, हम बस ये चाहते हैं कि रेट बढ़ जाए, चाहे कंपनी ये कह रही है लॉगिन आवर रहे कोई बात नहीं, पर रेट कम से कम ज़्यादा मिले, आदमी काम के लेकर पैसे के कराए, आदमी सोचता है कि लालच में करेगा आदमी काम, चलो भाई अगर रेट जैसे फालतू मिले, जैसे कि कंपनी कमर्शियली है कि भाई 12 से 4 में 3.5 घंटा लॉगिन रहना है, कम से कम पैसे तो थोड़े ज़्यादा दें, क्योंकि ज़्यादा गर्मी है, तो रेट पैसे थोड़े ज़्यादा देना चाहिए, सोचिए पैसे गर्मी में थोड़े ज़्यादा पैसे मिलते हैं।
Irfan isn't alone in this. Riders across the city describe the same math, the same clock, the same penalty, and the same heat. Dr. Mukhtar Alam has spent years working directly with gig and platform workers and has helped organize the demands around exactly this problem. We'll hear it from him now.
नहीं, हीट के लिए तो दरअसल वो सारी चीजें जो है एक्सट्रीम वेदर कंडीशंस में जो क्लाइमेट रेजिलिएंट वर्क है, तो उसमें जैसे जो भी अब एडवाइजरीज के तहत जो हर स्टेक होल्डर को जो करना है तो करना ही पड़ेगा। हीट में ही एल्गोरिथम्स का प्ले क्या एक चर्चा है या नहीं है, हीट की वजह से अगर लॉस हो रहा है, उसके वर्कर का जो अर्निंग अगर लॉस हो रहा है तो उसको क्या कंपनसेशन है, किस तरह का कंपनसेशन है, मिनिमम जो है जो लिविंग कॉस्ट है, कॉस्ट ऑफ लिविंग डिसेंट वर्क का। अब एक आदमी जैसे अभी ये टीनेंट है, रह रहे हैं, जैसे बोले कि हम बिहार से हैं, यहाँ किराए में रह रहे हैं, ठीक है, तो एक जैसे कि अब इससे की जैसे इन्होंने कहा कि पहले प्रिंटिंग मतलब एक मिसाल यही ले लिया जाए, तो ये एक माइग्रेंट वर्कर है यहाँ पर, किराए में रह रहे हैं, कभी जाते हैं घर, कभी नहीं जाते हैं, या सर मान लीजिए किसी की जमीन है तो वो जाते हैं फर्स्ट मौके पे, किसी का लैंडलेस है तो वो यहाँ आए ही हैं काम करने के लिए, तो बोले कि हम घर से बात करके आए हैं, तो ऐसी स्थिति थी। तो ऐसा कई सारा केसेस है कि नॉर्मली भागना, जैसे नबीफा का केस है कि मैं घर से भाग करके आया।
What Akbar Ali, Sheikh Alam, Muhammad Irfan, and other workers have described on the ground is routinely dismissed by authorities as subjective discomfort. To understand the true physical impact of thermal exposure, we must look to the empirical science.
When we say we measure something, we call it as WBGT, which is wet bulb globe temperature. And wet bulb globe temperature just means how our body reacts to or responds to heat exposures. It combines your sweating, your temperature radiation from the globe or from processes, your dry bulb, which is the air temperature, all of this together, and plus the wind velocity and the clothing that we are wearing. So it kind of has everything that a human body will have and how our body will expect to respond to a heat exposure. Of course, you see at least 80 to 90% of the population that we go and survey or above the safe limits of exposure for the kind of work that they do. Generally, we do it with trained people who are mostly industrial hygienists or people from our team who are very trained on heat stress and physiological strain monitoring. So we just don't only do the heat measurements, which is environmental measurement. We also do the physiological strain measurement. When you have a heat exposure, you have a response. We also try and measure the responses to that. Responses doesn't have to be adverse. There is something that happens in the body when you're exposed to something. For example, in the case of heat, when you're exposed to, your core body temperature starts to rise inside. It's like your internal body temperature starts to rise. It could be exposures from your heat, plus also when we are working, because we're talking about laborers, they are working. So depending on the kind of work that you do, the workload it is called, your internal body temperature rises.
Dr. Vidya, your research found that over 80% of workers who were studied were exposed to heat above recommended thresholds. I'd like to know, what does that number mean in practice? What happens to a worker's body when heat reaches above recommended thresholds?
If a person is exposed to, let us say, more than 27.5, because that is the threshold for a person with heavy workload. And most of these jobs which are informal in brick or in salt pans, agriculture, all of this are moderate to heavy work. So it's beyond 28 degree, you're anyway affected. One thing is you might have a range of heat related illnesses. It is a continuum. It starts with a small headache and then it goes with sweating. And then, if your internal body temperature is not controlled, then it moves to the next level. Then you don't start to seeing thirst and everything. And then if the body internal temperature reaches to 42, 43, heat stroke. It doesn't just go to heat stroke, right? So it starts and then moves towards heat stroke. So during those periods, what usually happens is your brain and your muscles don't get as much blood as it is supposed to get, because it's trying to, send the blood all to the extremities so that it can cool down itself. So there is deficiency of blood in your brain and in your muscles, both of which is very important for a worker. He needs to be alert to be working well. And then we ourselves have faced during heat when we are walking outside and we're coming, half the time we are not able to, make the things right, or we don't understand things, right? Second thing is when you have less blood to the muscles, there is always muscle fatigue. and then workers are not able to work as much as they should. So they are not able to complete their targets. So they have to work extended hours to complete the same target that they would have naturally finished in 8 hours. Or they would make a lot of mistakes in their work. There might be accidents that are happening in the work. There might be fatal deaths also that happens. There is this worker in Uttar Pradesh only, and we also have one case in Tamil Nadu. There was this guy who was like in the 4th or 5th floor in a construction, and then suddenly he started feeling dizzy and he fell down and there was a net. So he had some fractures, but he didn't die. But in Uttar Pradesh, he fell from the top. People thought he fell from the top, but the co-worker said he had dizziness. This could be because of the heat, and then it was fatal. So it is just not what happens because of heat related issues, but there are other things that also happen, which are kind of, some of them are directly related to heat related issues.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Vidya. Despite these grave consequences, Dr. Vidya, we've also learned that workers are very reluctant to report heat related symptoms.
It's just not here, Bhoomika. It's happening in Central America. It's mostly culturally based. When you go to the Central American countries, when you go to low economies, you would see the way that they are tuned or trained to speak out the issues is a little different. It's just that it's all about supply and demand. We have a lot and lots of supply of workers. Demand is also high. But what happens is, if a worker starts complaining about heat and everything, you see, especially the migrants, they have their language problems. I see at least in Tamil Nadu, we have about 3 to 5 lakh migrant workers across Tamil Nadu. Many of them working in hotels, restaurants, but many of them are also working in metros and all these big bread kilns, all of that. So they are right there looking out for work. So they just endure it. And if they say, if you are going to raise anything, then you might not be the person who will be selected for the next day's job. So it is out of fear of losing the job. Many of them don't say, but that is not only happening here. It is happening across the world. It's a social problem, I would say.
You just mentioned about migration, and I'd like to learn more about that. How does heat exposure intersect with the experience of migrant workers specifically?
The problem is migrant workers face a double burden of heat because they work in heat like any other worker, a local worker, but they also face issues because they always live in makeshift homes. So they don't have a proper home. They don't have the social support. They don't have the family support. So they all kind of live together and makeshift homes and everything, where your cooling is not the best, right? I'm not saying any laborer in Tamil Nadu comes home to an air-conditioned home. But locals probably have a home that has a coconut thatched roof. Then they probably have somebody to cook them, even if it is a cooling food, rice soaked in water or things like that, which is not possible for a migrant worker. If they have any issues, they are also not being able to be very vocal about it because of the language issues, because of their situation where they don't even want to raise any issues. And if at all they have any problems, with health-related problems. Now at least we have this Aadhaar card and all of this business, but healthcare access is mostly better for locals compared to migrants. So they bear the double burden of heat compared to the locals is what I would say, though the exposures are the same.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. What have you seen through the data that you've gathered? What's the most shocking thing that has come out?
Many workplaces, the general myth is outdoor workers are more exposed. What we have found is many of the indoor places, if they don't have proper ventilation, if there is a lot of process generated heat like in food manufacturing unit or something like that, their temperatures are much, much higher than what it's outside. Mm-hmm. At least outside you have a little bit more wind velocity and then, it's a little bit open. So sometimes we see the outdoor WBGT is much lower than indoor WBGT. Or the heat, the humidity and everything is much, much higher indoors. So that kind of changed the way we think about heat when it comes to indoor places. And people are kind of trapped in those places. So many of the small and medium enterprises which just operate with like 10 or 20 people in a small room without ventilation, especially in places like Dharavi and in Andhra Pradesh, small places, in some slums that we also see, which are kind of very telescopic. There will be like, rows and rows of houses, and they will be doing this kind of work, and it's called a small and medium enterprise. So we have actually seen issues coming more from those places, and the myth for us researchers has gone now. But the myth for people who are inside the homes think we are not in heat, so we are a little bit more safer. So that comes as a surprise to us. And many times when these people get heat strokes and everything, it comes as a surprise to them. That's because of the lack of knowledge. It's just not working under the sun. It's working in heat. So I think that was the take-home message for all of us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vidya. This is a very important point that you've pointed out. So far, a lot of heat stress discussions are all around construction workers, gig workers. But even in my experience, like you have mentioned, we have seen garment factory workers or say workers in the electronic industry facing issues from heat stress, although very different, but very perceptible and a very urgent heat stress issue. In that respect, Dr. Vidya, can you throw some more light? I mean, you've looked at heat stress across the sectors. I've read your papers on the construction industry, agriculture, brick kilns, salt pans, garment industry. So are there meaningful differences that you see in how heat harms workers, or do you feel the pattern is fundamentally the same?
I would say the pattern would be fundamentally the same because, a response to heat by a human body is going to be the same for everybody, right? Especially for acclimatized workers, because there is always this big debate that happens whenever I go abroad for any of these big meetings. They always say, you're in India, heat is very natural, and where is the problem, So but again, a human body can only be acclimatized for about a degree. For example, a salt pan worker who is working outside, a brick kiln worker who is working outside, probably has other risk factors that would exacerbate the heat issue. But basically, when you're speaking about heat exposure and its response, human body will react exactly the same way. Small individual differences are there. Some people a little bit more heat resilient than the others. But again, there is also this little threshold beyond which 1 degree temperature, if there is an increase, what would happen is you call it as a fever inside your body. Instead of 98.5, if you have 99.5, you call it as a fever. But there are workers who are working in fever, not because of infection, but because of your core body temperature rise, and sometimes as much as even 2 degree in heat. And you don't call it as fever, but you call it as like a physiological strain. So beyond 1 degree, everybody is affected. Beyond 1 degree internal body temperature. Garment industry, because of the piece rate, because of the behavior, because of the targets, people do not take the risks, people do not hydrate themselves, all of that. But when it comes to salt pan, brick kilns, they are all open. Agriculture, they're all open. So many times you see workers, they can self-pace, which is like a positive thing. But in brick kilns and salt pans, they have their own targets as well. And in salt pans and brick kilns, many of these informal workplaces, they do not have toilets. Yeah. So workers kind of restrict their fluid intake and food intake so that they don't have to access toilets. This is more so important for women workers. Men can relieve themselves because of their anatomy and everything. But for women, where can you go and find a toilet near a salt pan? It's open sea. People are working on miles and miles of salt pan. So we see those kind of factors exacerbate their issues. So there are differences because of the core risk factors, not because of the heat. Heat affects people exactly the same.
Right. Again, Dr. Vidya, you've driven a very, very important point that heat is the same, but how it manifests is different. And that's why heat becomes not just a climate problem, but it's a caste problem, it's a class problem, and it's also a gender problem. And with that, we come to the last question for today. And that would be, if you had to name the single most important change that India's heat governance system needs right now, what would that be?
It is almost next to impossible. Whether it is a high-income country, low-income country, does not matter. It is absolutely impossible for the government to reach every single person. Building individual resilience. what people should eat. Nutrition, gives you resilience, right? During COVID times, we were asked to eat so many things. We were asked to do self-prevention, that kind of education, recognizing the signs and symptoms so that, when you know that you're in stage 2, you can, protect yourself, stop work, go back, drink your water, wash your face, put a wet towel around your neck. All these things are very, very important. And I would say heat action plan or the government labor ministry should put the onus on the employer. Employers, they have the CSR money. It is not only to be used only for eye camps. It can be used for protecting the workers, right? So it should be a part of them where they need to make sure that, now every construction company, every morning they are having a safety toolbox stock. It has become a norm. Let them have, during summer seasons, a safety toolbox stock. Let them have their own cool pods where, you will have, instead of tea, they will have buttermilk and things like that. What they should eat, what they should not eat. Parota, maida ka parota and all of that is very, very cheap now in Chennai, right? So, but the time it takes for you to digest it, rather than, if a worker takes before going to work, if he takes idli, dosa or whatever, compared to what he takes, the rice water or some, it's much more cooling, much more resilient. What kind of foods he should, this kind of education should happen. If possible, employer can, they are making profits. If possible, they can, at least education should be there. And that should be in the media all the time. During COVID, every channel was asked to telecast about how to prevent people from COVID, right? 2 minutes, 30 seconds. No, all of this should be a part of the CSR program. So I think this kind of change would protect at least 50% of the people without actually government going to them. Individual resilience will increase.
What we've heard today from waste picking workers or delivery workers isn't just a collection of isolated stories. It is the evidence of a systemic unmeasured tax on the human body due to heat. As Dr. Vidya's research shows, extreme thermal stress inflicts severe biological damage, from acute dehydration to irreversible organ failure. Yet, because roughly 90% of India's workforce operates in the informal economy, this harm remains structurally invisible. The system does not fail to record heat illness by accident. It is just designed not to measure it. But there's been real movement on paper recently. Heat waves were formally added to India's list of notified national disasters this year, which means states can finally now draw on the national disaster funds to respond. But recognition on a disaster list is not the same as protection on a factory floor or a delivery route. It unlocks emergency funding after the fact. It does nothing to change how or whether the heat a worker faces today gets measured or acted on before it becomes an emergency. And that brings us to a fundamental contradiction. Every summer, government authorities issue heat alerts based on standard air temperature. But standard temperature ignores humidity, solar radiation, and physical exertion, meaning workers collapse long before an official heat wave is ever declared. So why do our public health alerts and labor laws still rely on a metric that completely misrepresents the real danger to a worker's body? Next time on The Heat Shift, Episode 2, titled The Index Blind Spot, we examine the battle over wet bulb globe temperature and how scientific data can force legal accountability. Subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. I'm Bhoomika Choudhury. Thank you for listening.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
Chandatai Tiwari is an award-winning folk artist in Maharashtra. But as a child, she was discouraged by her father to even speak in Marathi when she was growing up in the holy town of Pandharpur. That resistance was rooted in the family's migration history from about a century ago.
Watch the full video on the Marwadi roots of Maharashtra's most popular Bharud singer, Chandatai Tiwari, only on the Migration Stories YouTube channel.
The Migration Story.